missed that somehow. This is the, go ahead, here's J. Lou Sines. J. Lou Sines was a teacher. He had to keep moving because he would lose his job when he would complain about racial segregation and discrimination. They also corresponded. Next. Okay, moving into the 1930s. Even at this 1930 LULAC conference, we can see that women are present there. So they may not be members, but believe me, they are not just there to cook, they are also listening, and they are doing different things to help the organization. So eventually they are admitted a few years later. Next. This is a picture of Alice Dickerson Montemayor. She is the most important feminist in LULAC before the 1970s. Next. Moving on to the 40s. Next. This again is Pedro Vento, Adela's husband, with the 2 children. And again, we do know that according to her, he nagged her about her activism, but she continued, and he so-called allowed her to do so anyway. Next. Moving into the 1950s. This is a program for the convention which is against the so-called wetback pamphlet. It was a racist, the name was racist, and some of the anonymous oral interviews with people were published without any kind of editing. So a racist perspective of the Mexican community was given, and people responded at this conference. Several hundred are in attendance. Next. This is a picture of Mexican immigrants, so-called wetbacks, being returned in Edinburgh. Next. This is a picture of Adela Sloss-Vento in her more mature years in the 50s or so. Next. Moving on to the 60s, we start getting into the Chicano movement. And again, as I mentioned, Adela Sloss-Vento praised the young protesters who argued that they didn't have enough Mexican-American teachers, they had no Mexican-American curriculum, and they wanted Spanish in the schools. Next. And moving into the 1970s, this is my favorite picture of Adela Sloss-Vento in her yard, because she looks like a typical señora, just a regular, ordinary so-called lady, but she is a fiery activist and thinker. Next. Next. Adela Sloss-Vento wrote a book in 1977 about Perales. It's a major biography. She knew him intimately. She collected documents. She paid about $7,000 to publish it herself. It did not get much play, but it was an important book. And she felt that he needed to be praised for his genius and for all he did. And again, my forthcoming book on Perales will show that she was correct in recognizing his genius, except for the exclusion of women. Next. Moving into the 1980s. Next. Whether you can really see it or not, on the top left is a picture of Adela Sloss in a mural, in a Chicana mural in the Midwest. That's the only image I know of her anywhere where she is recognized. Next. And by the 1990s, she's quite up there in age. Remember, she's born in 1901, but her very last political statement was a letter that she wrote to Governor Ann Richards, the second woman governor in the state of Texas. And we don't have her letter to Ann Richards, but we have Ann Richards' generic response to Adela Sloss, and she thanks her, and Richard thanks Adela Sloss-Vento for recognizing her vision, her Ann Richards' vision. And I sat there and I laughed, because I realized that that vision was Adela Sloss-Vento's vision, because Adela Sloss-Vento had been fighting for women's suffrage all her life. And with that, I would like to move on to the last slide. which shows you some credits. And I would like to thank you for inviting me to be with you here today. And I'm open for questions at this point.
All right. Yes, I want to remind everybody that they can submit questions on Facebook. We have received a couple of questions already, so we'll start with them. The first question is, how did the men of LULAC treat Adela Sloss-Vento? Was her work valued by other members of LULAC? And was there a difference between how she was treated versus how Alice Dickerson Montemayor was treated?
Yes. Okay, yes. And I should say, first of all, we have one source that says that she had joined a ladies' LULAC in Alice, Texas, or it was going to become the ladies' LULAC. But I found no other documentation anywhere that suggests she was an actual member. And so it's somewhat interesting that she mostly chooses her political activity outside of most organizations, including LULAC. So she did not join Ladies LULAC. She did not join LULAC when it was open for men and women, and she's mostly an independent person. I do make comparisons with Alice Dickerson Montemayor, who complained about the sexism in LULAC and actually wrote an article called Son Muy Hombres. They're very male, they're very macho, they're very sexist, because Alice Dickerson Montemayor confronted the sexism head on, while Adela Sloss-Vento did not confront gender segregation and sexism in LULAC. I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. Here we go. Okay, another question is about this law that said that if you were a US citizen and you married a foreigner, that you would lose your citizenship.
Yes.
The question was just, do you know how long that was in effect and
Yes.
how it ended up going away?
Yes, 1907 to 1922. It's called, again, the Expatriation Act. I don't have more information. But it was a very disempowering way to deal with women, and also assume that wives were basically the tools and appendages of their husbands. Again, the thinking is that, the old time thinking is that a wife is the same as her husband, and therefore their lot should be the same.
Wow, okay. I also have a question about, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that in New Mexico, there were a number of women who were very active in the suffrage movement. And then when you moved into Texas, we had a very different situation.
Yes.
What were the, if you could speak a little to the atmosphere or the,
Yes.
what was happening in New Mexico that made that possible?
Okay, again, remember, in New Mexico, the Hispanic population is the majority until 1940, okay? And people don't realize that is what gave them their power, was demography, okay? Whereas in Texas, my God, as soon as, actually in 1830, as soon as people like Stephen F. Austin came in, the Tejanas, people of Mexican descent, were outnumbered 10-1. And so when the Constitution of Texas was written, there were 3 Tejanos on writing the state constitution, and there were attempts to disenfranchise the Mexican descent community. So the racism in Texas means that since the Texas Revolution, since the US-Mexico War, the racism in Texas has been extreme. The white women suffragists would not have been in the same room as a dirty Mexican woman, and that's how we would have been seen. So we were not in their clubs, they didn't want us, and thank God we didn't have to put up with their denigration. But also, the 1910s had the question of lynching, and basic survival was so important. And racial violence, especially in South Texas in the 1910s, survival was the most important thing, and it probably seemed to some that suffrage would have even been a luxury.
We also have a question about Adela's network, and in terms of who was supporting her efforts?
Okay, well, again, her husband, again, I refer to him as a modern man, but interestingly enough, it seems like the only place she really connects with women is at the church. Okay, and we don't even have that many materials about her activism in the church, but she works independently. But when she writes people, they're all men. Okay, so her network is Alonso Perales, J.T. Canales, J. Lou Saenz, and then a couple of other people who are more prominent after the 50s, but not women.
One of the things that really comes across in your talk is that this exclusion of women from so many of the early Latino, Mexican American organizations, I think indicates to us that we have to broaden our understanding of women's activism in terms of where we're looking for it. Yes. And we need to better excavate these stories. And I know that you have been doing this for years, especially I'm thinking about all of your work with the Handbook of Texas. So how do you do that? How do you excavate these stories?
Well, I like details and I love archives. I probably would not be overstating that I have probably spent more time in the Benson Latin American Collection archives probably than anybody else, period. Okay, maybe some Latin Americanists, but in terms of the Mexican American materials, I know them pretty well. And as mentioned, I've been doing this work since 1978. And in 1978, Adela Sloss-Vento was the person who opened up a little bit of her archives, just a handful of her archives, so I could begin to do this kind of work. But the materials have been there for years. Let me give you another example. The New York Times recently published an article about Jovita Edad from Laredo as a suffragist, Mexican American suffragist that we should know. Well, Jose Limon, who actually was one of my professors along with Domenico Paredes, I'm proud to say, wrote about Jovita Edad in an important article in 1975. That was 45 years it took to get Jovita Edad to be mainstream, and mostly because of the work of Dr. Gabriela Gonzalez, okay, because she has an important book that talks about her. But in other words, our stuff is very much buried in the archives, and that's why it behooves those of us who have this information to share it with the general public, because it's still not in most of the textbooks. Things are getting better, but it's still very, very slow.
I don't have any more audience questions, and so I think what I would like to just maybe close with is, oops.
We've got plenty of time. Come up with some questions, folks.
That's true. That's true. Feel free to. I can keep talking to Cynthia for a while, but one of the things that I've just been thinking about is it's an election year. And we have all of these Latino, Mexican American stories that are not necessarily part of the national narrative, even though it seems like they should be. Yes. And so I just wonder, you've mentioned that we need to be in the archive, we need to be doing this work, but maybe, especially for undergrads who might be watching, what are some things that they can do? What are some things that maybe... Yeah.
I always tell undergraduates, do not be subordinate to a graduate student or a professor that wants to use you as a worker. Be your own intellectual, get your own stuff published. There's tons of places to publish this stuff. Start early. Again, I started as a sophomore. And there's no reason you have to be a graduate student or a PhD to do this research. There's so many things that people that we need to know about that we still don't have books or journal articles or even newspaper articles about. So just get active and start getting it out there.
Mm-hmm. And what's next for you?
Actually, I think my next project, I ran across something that I forgot I had done, and I ran across a newspaper called El Paladín, which means the night, from Corpus Christi, and it was actually a LULAC newspaper. And in the 1980s, before the computer existed, I actually went through it and made a listing of articles from a 10-year span, and I made a listing of chronology of events for 10 years. And then I also began a listing of business advertisements. So it's a rich resource for people interested in Corpus, Robstown, or LULAC in general, because it starts as kind of an unofficial LULAC newspaper. So that's probably my next project. I might also mention that down the line, my mother was an activist. My mother was in LULAC in Cuero in the 1970s. My mother, so that's also a future project. But I'm also quite excited about the fact that the Perales book is almost out. And I hope people will really come to see, as I mentioned, the genius of Alonso Perales, a U.S. diplomat, major founder of LULAC, and the most important civil rights activist, and I'm actually going to say it, in the United States of the 20th century is Alonso Perales, and mostly because of his work with the LULAC organization.
Okay, we have another audience question. Can you tell us more about just how progressive Adela was, perhaps more so than many of the men in LULAC?
Okay, well, she's, you know, again, we have to put her in her times. You know, she's not progressive the way we might think about post-Chicano movement progressivism. But, you know, we definitely know that we could say she's not a Republican, she's a Democrat, but with reservations, because she does support the Raza Unida party. She does support Chicano feminism. She supports, and I talk a little bit about that, the idea of young women being professionals and not taking crap from men. And she's quite independent. But again, she does this as a wife and as a mother, but is still able to advance some things. Again, she is part of her generation. She appreciates motherhood. She appreciates wifedom, as far as we can tell. But she wants her politics to be the most important thing for her. That really is what gives her life and meaning.
We have a question about finding sources. So what have you found to be very useful as a repository for sources outside of, for example, major universities or archival centers?
Okay, well, you know what? There's so many newspapers that are out there. It's a lot of work, okay? And some newspapers are online. I mean, somebody could actually take 1 year or even a month of a newspaper and critically analyze it. For example, we know the La Prensa newspaper is so important, not just to San Antonio and Texas, but other parts of Latin America, etc. We don't have a book on La Prensa. We don't have a book on Mexican San Antonio. We are so lacking in usable information in the form of books, journal articles, material on the internet. There's just so many things that need to be done.
Okay, I think this is going to be the last audience question, and that's, did Adela's children become activists too?
Dr. Arnoldo Vento, as noted, he became a Spanish professor and a professor of Chicano studies. I don't know the extent of his own activism. I know he was pro-Chicano movement. He has written about people like Ricardo Sanchez and Adelista. He was a Chicano studies professor. Even her daughter had I believe it was a doctorate in English. She unfortunately has passed, but she worked in the jail not because she liked it or because they needed it. Her husband had a middle-class job, but she wanted to educate her children in college, and therefore she suffered physically and other ways so that she could provide them a better future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. It's always so wonderful to hear you speak. You're one of the most inspiring public historians I know. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you.
We are going to look at a slide about your book. Your book is now available for purchase through UT Press. Also, it's being sold through Target and Walmart. So get yourself a copy. And I think I'm going to turn it. Oh, also, do you or any of your family members have old poll tax receipts in your archives, your trunks, your albums? The Museo del West Side would be very interested in getting digital copies of those for their collection. You can reach out to the museo by emailing museo@esperanzacenter.org. And now I'm going to turn it over to Graciela.
Well, thank you. Thank you on behalf of the Esperanza for West Side Preservation Alliance. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I want to especially thank Sarah Zenaida Gould, Antonia Castañeda, the most distinguished Doctora Cynthia Orozco, for giving us all this love and attention to the history of our Mexicanos, Mexican-American community of San Antonio, South Texas, and of this country as well. And we need to follow her, just what she said. Let's go out there, let's search. Let's go into mom and dad's and abuelita's little boxes and see what they left over. And yeah, find that poll tax, find their little border crossing paperwork. It's all our history and nobody's doing it. We have to take it on, and there are not enough historians with PhDs, so we have to become the people's PhDs at the community level. Right? Good. And I guess, Natalie, you can go ahead and do the slide. We want to remind everybody that our work is funded by the City of San Antonio's Department of Arts and Cultural Affairs, the National Endowment for the Arts, Texas Arts, and the Buena Gente of the Esperanza. And I bring up the fact that it's part of it is city funding. We are going through the city budget right now, and they have said that art, again, is not essential. And we want to remind the community that arte es vida, cultura es vida. These are our histories. This is our culture. And organizations like the Esperanza, Centro Cultural, and the other Latino arts organizations are the ones that are helping to ground us in our history, cultures, and traditions. So we need to tell council members, the mayor, that they need to support the cultural arts of our communities and not to cut them, especially in this moment of the COVID. Our communities are the ones that are dying. We suffer, we lack so much because we come with this racist history that has denied us so much. And this current council just finished supporting a proposition that said they were against racism because it was it hurt our health and well-being. So how can we then discuss cutting back the arts? So please, this next slide should have a little bit information about calling. Well, you can call 311 and ask for your council member. Ask for Trevino, Sullivan, Villagrán, Shirley Gonzalez, Garcia. Here they all are, all council people. And most importantly, also call the mayor. If you don't remember these numbers, call 311, but also search onto the website. If you're on this if you're on this internet moment, this program, you're connected to the internet, so you have access to these numbers via the computer. So next slide. And again, if you haven't, today was the inauguration of the Museo del West's website. And thank you, Natalie, for putting, that's my mom, as a 80-something-year-old, and the little girl in the middle is her as a 1-year-old. So again, we want to continue to tell our history. So the Museo del West Side is the only community museo that is dedicated to the history of San Antonio, of the Mexican American community of the West Side. So join us, visit museodelwestside.org so you can see this beautiful exhibit that's up right now that has identified the stories of 15 women. It's just the beginning. It was just the kickoff. We hope by next month we have another 15 mujeres in there. You get to help us by telling the stories of your grandmother, your great-grandmother, tías, tíos, women like Adela Sloss-Vento. So you find those mujeres, especially in this moment of the 100th anniversary celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But think of all the beautiful people that make up this historic West Side. Next slide. And again, just to remind you, besides the foundations, we depend so much on people like yourselves that are watching this. So consider becoming a monthly donor. Call the Esperanza at 210-228-0201, or go to our website, www.esperanzacenter.org/donate. Again, thank you, and appreciate you. Remember, where else would you get this sort of programming? At the Esperanza. And say, muchas gracias y buenas noches. Good night.